You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're excited to welcome Dr. Rachelle Campbell to the podcast. Dr. Campbell is an assistant professor of special education at the University of Missouri, specializing in culturally responsive practices and interventions for minoritized students in underserved communities. Her research focuses on reducing exclusionary discipline practices and enhancing student-teacher relationships to improve academic, social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. Welcome, Dr. Campbell.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. And you know what? This is like perfect timing because in a month or so, we're going to have a lot of children going back to schools. We're going to have a lot of parents that are going to be put in situations where they're going to have to start their advocation role, where they're doing a lot of advocacy for their own child. And I think talking about some of these subjects in advance is going to be absolutely empowering for everyone. But before we go there, one thing I love to be able to do is to understand where the passion of the work that you're doing comes from. So you are really involved in the school systems, and you're involved with behavioral work, and you have some work in your history that has focused specifically on autism. So where do those three things converge? Where do those passions start?
Kind of what sparked my interest was early in my master's program. My background's in clinical psychology. So I got my master's in clinical psychology from North Carolina Central University, and I did my practicum experience there in the College Counseling Center, which was a very interesting and enlightening experience. I actually had the opportunity to encounter a number of college students that had autism. And in doing so, I realized that these students had very unique strengths, but with those strengths, they also had a number of challenges. And so the complexity of the needs that they had for our counseling sessions and continued supports really pushed me to be able to want to impact students and children with disabilities, and figure out how to make their experiences more positive, so that it could, motivate them into understanding more of, what was going on with them, and kind of not to focus on things that made them feel different than others, was really what I was driven to do. And then I also wanted to work in a field and do something where I could develop effective interventions for these students, and specifically even looking at minoritized students that have autism.
Yeah, and I mean, I hear just kind of as you're talking through this in my brain, what I'm hearing are empowerment, empowerment, empowerment. It's how do you make sure that everybody from those college students that you're able to see when you're at North Carolina Central, it's that idea of, everybody's got unique skills, everybody's got unique talents, and how do you help everyone to achieve those goals and create a community around them that sees everyone with value? I would imagine that's so much harder with minoritized students. So, what are some of those unique challenges that minoritized students in underserved communities face as far as their lack of empowerment, lack of support, lack of resources, and lack of understanding of those who are working with them?
Yeah, so well, you touched on a couple. So oftentimes students, who are being educated in underserved communities, their schools, their neighborhoods, they do lack resources. Sometimes teachers and administrators in those specific areas in those schools, sometimes their expectations are lower for that group of students, which can really be negatively impactful. And then oftentimes, because they're often, given, hand-me-down curricula or things at another school or area is no longer has use for, the curriculum that they are provided with normally is not culturally relevant for that population of students. And then Oftentimes, people can feel like just because the teachers may look the same as their students, like may be of the same race or ethnic group, that there's um, automatically some sort of, um, you know, identity link or like understanding that they're going to get from the teacher. But honestly, if a teacher, regardless of their race or background, if they haven't been taught culturally responsive practices, if they haven't been taught the strategies to help validate students, looking at the different identities of these students' families, um, ways to promote inclusivity, for students with disabilities, without disabilities. Um, Also, if they're not aware of how to tailor their instruction to fit the unique needs of their students, so taking the resources that they are provided, but then making adaptations and modifications to it so that it's applicable to the group of students that they're working with. If they're not able to do those things, then they're just not going to foster the appropriate inclusive learning environment. And if you're not able to do that, then children will often feel unsafe. They perhaps will feel misunderstood, and they won't feel valued in that space.
I mean, without value, it almost encourages underperformance, I'd imagine, across the board, is that if you don't feel like you have a role, a place, safety within that environment where somebody trusts you, is
Absolutely.
that ultimately you're not going to be your best self. But you had mentioned the value of teachers. I would imagine this goes to practitioners outside of the school and then also for administrators of understanding their community, understanding the diversity of their community, and being able to really work with the family unit to understand their values and how they best can support their child and how the teacher can support them in the classroom. But what happens when that communication and that understanding is not happening or it's devalued and it's kind of I'm going to push my particular teaching agenda regardless of what's important for that individual, that community, that culture, and I'm going to still do it my way versus understanding how to be more responsive in the care.
Yeah, so, oftentimes when that happens, and I see this oftentimes with new teachers who are really excited, or you can see this with some of your more seasoned teachers who they're like, this has worked for, 80% of my students for however many years. And what happens is you never build that rapport with that child's family. And if you cannot get the family support, any issue that you have with that child, whether it be academic, behavioral, social, or emotional, if you don't have the support of that family or whoever is in charge of caregiving for that particular student, you basically have a hard task on your hand the entire school year. You have no one that you can turn to help further the supports that you want to put in place for the child. You really have no one that you're able to turn to help you identify with the child because when you chose to make the statement like you know best and to have that deficit based approach with that child's family where they're beneath you,
Mm-hmm.
as you being in the profession as the teacher, you're on your own.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when you have an administration team who has other students that they're also trying to wrestle with and get supports for, and they see that the family communication is not there or that lifeline is just really dead, then everyone's just doing what they can to tolerate the child in the space. And in tolerating the child in the space, that student doesn't get what they need academically, and you as a teacher just it contributes to your burnt out calculator. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, so
And I
it's
could see that contributing immediately, just even in a dynamic that would be saying it's a me versus you and us versus them dynamic of kind of how the school day would be going for that individual is, the teacher now is saying you're resistant to what I'm trying to do. Or this group of students is going to constantly be hesitant or unwilling to adapt to my teaching methodology versus it kind of being the other way around, where it's, I at times need to be flexible to being able to get there and teach that learner. When you have, the culturally or linguistically diverse learners, how, and I guess we'll start on a systems and then move to an individual level, but how do you really care for them within the school setting in a way that you're helping them to achieve all their goals? And maybe we can talk broadly in a system setup first.
I would say the first thing to do to care for this group of students broadly is you have to understand, their identities. And in doing so, um, you have to realize that in understanding their identities, you're also understanding their culture. And their culture is not just like Black culture, Latinx culture, or hip hop or sports or whatever it is. Their culture is like what's happening in their family ecosystem at home. So, is the culture of your family life one where you hear the word no? Is this a word that you hear often? Asking, their families, do you tell this child no often? How do they respond to the word no? Especially like post COVID, like a lot of parents trying to work at home, trying to work through the pandemic. It's just like whatever to make you be quiet so I can do what I need to do on my computer. So hearing the word no is maybe something that students haven't heard a lot. They've heard like not right now, later, give me a few. So a teacher really needs to understand like the first time that a student's going to be hearing no and we're going to stick with no, like might
Hmm.
be in my classroom. The other thing that we have to understand is where does education fall in this child's family culture? What other responsibilities are placed on this child? So understanding that, okay, you have a fourth grader. Okay, you would think like, okay, this child is 9, going on 10. Seems that they should pretty much be a kid. But maybe we find out they have three younger siblings and they're already doing a lot of like teenager, adult like
Hmm.
responsibilities. And so maybe when they get home, the first thing they do is not sit down and take out their book bag and what it is that you have assigned for them to do that night. Like they got to make sure that like everybody gets off the bus or like everybody is settled while whomever might be getting ready to go to work or might be settling in from work and then has to make sure there's a snack for everybody and then they get a
Hmm.
snack. And so maybe by the time it's time for them to do homework, they never do it because they're tired and they're going
Yeah.
to bed. So understanding if like when the time, what time of day that it might occur that they may have time to focus on your out of school work. Like, is it already like 9:15 at night? Is it already 9:30? So having these conversations in the beginning with your families when you're just saying like, I'm just trying to get to understand your home life culture and like how school and our class fits in that ecosystem. And this is a way to keep parents and guardians like off the defense because you're
Hmm.
coming to them asking about what's happening in their space without saying, I'm asking you this because your child is this, or your child is a deficit at this, or they're not great at this. Like everything is on a baseline, evil, like an even playing field. And so it's really important to have these understandings in the beginning so that you're not asking them when a parent feels like they need to be defensive. And so this
Hmm.
way, if all of a sudden you're sending homework home and it's never coming back, or you're sending, sheets that need signing or screeners that need filled out and it's not coming back, you can go back to this little quick interview you did with this family and be like, oh, mom works overnight. She comes in at 7:45. The bus is picking up at X. Like, I just need to try and connect with mom like at 2 p.m., like maybe when she's getting up or with dad or whomever. Like, go back to that and see how you can understand and connect with that family versus approaching them where you're saying, this is wrong, this isn't right with your kid. And now I want to know, like, what's your problem and what y'all doing at home? Um,
Yeah.
so the best way is to form that partnership and then use what you learn in that partnership to shape how you're going to educate that child. And it might be for that particular child, they need to go in a classroom where a teacher is more flexible in their thinking, not to the teacher who is like, well, I send homework home and if they don't do it, like it's zeros and they're just, they're not going to pass. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't give a child whose parent kind of expressed those concerns that sort of teacher. You don't want to put them with a teacher who'll be like, well, I'm on the fence about homework. Like, such and such gets here early because they come to, before school care, or they eat breakfast here every morning. I can see what amount of homework they can accomplish during that time, you
Yeah.
know, and I'll grade them based on that, because I know they can't do it at home. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so just real having the teacher that's going to be empathetic and understanding to what's needed for that child's success, because no one became a genius off of homework alone. So that's what I like to tell teachers, like, homework is not indicative of that you're even teaching the students anything. You don't know who did that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm hearing, like, I mean, just the general concept of that partnership and how important that is and where it actually starts. I think a lot of us don't realize all the advanced planning that administration has to do to be able to make sure they're setting a child up for success. But
Hmm.
beyond that, the way that and I'd love it if you could correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that you were defining culture, as far as, you have to actually be looking at the experience plus the identity to be able to really be able to understand where
Hmm.
culture impacts a child, a family unit, an individual. Um, is that oftentimes, like you said, is that we get into this overgeneralization with culture where we stop at, like almost like the visible part of somebody's culture versus kind of digging deep and asking questions. So when you're trying to set up that system, a lot of us go with assumptions, and that I think causes more harm than good. When
Right?
you're coaching folks, how much is it as far as that ability to ask the right questions, the listening? Are there tools that schools should be using or to be able to help guide their teachers because the teaching profession isn't necessarily seasoned all the time?
Yeah, so the first thing that I like to tell schools, like when they ask like how we can talk to teachers about this, is a training on just really how you talk to families is really important. And body language, tone of voice, all of those things are a part of the conversation. And so those are things that, at least in communities of color, that people really pay attention to. And sometimes they pay more attention to your body language, your tone of voice, how you're looking at them. They pay more attention to that sometimes than what's coming out of your mouth, because it gives them overall vibes about like how you perceive them and how you feel about them. So I like to explain to teachers that we have to be very careful about our disposition, and making sure that you're sincere, with these families. They'll respect you a lot more for saying, you know, I was a little uneasy about coming to you, like even trying to talk to you, because I just have felt kind of off put. They would respect that more than you being like, hi, how are you doing? I'm so glad that Zahir is in my class. Like,
Hmm.
when no, you're not happy Zahir is in your class because you heard Zahir is blah, blah, blah. Like, they'll respect it a lot more if you go, like, I've heard that Zahir has had some challenges with some other teachers here. But you know what? I want to work to change that. And to do that, I'd like to ask you some questions, just understand a little bit about you guys' culture at home and like how I can implement some of these things into the classroom so that Zahir feels safe and welcome in this space. Um,
Hmm.
so they'll respect that a lot more than you being like fake, genuine,
Yep.
because people can sense that. So I like to tell them, just be genuine in how you talk to families, guardians and parents, and that's one way to begin to build respect, because when you're genuine, then they too can say like, yeah, like, I almost didn't want to send him back to this school, but it's a school in this district, and so I do want him to have a better year. I do want this, so that you both can start in a place of building.
Hmm.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is, for schools that are less white, I try to warn them of being very heavy on behavioral screeners, um, that past teachers have filled out without teachers being aware of implicit biases that they may have. Um,
Hmm.
and so I tell them, like, when you're working with students in an underserved community, they are not all the same. Like you are going to meet some students who are hiding from gunshots by like immersing themselves reading books every night and they can read really well. And then you're going to have some kids who are out, trying to figure out like, how they can be a part of this group so that they can feel protected. Like everyone has a different space that they're coming from. So don't ever just group them all together and just feel that they're all alike. So treat each child like an individual case. And sometimes that's easier said than done. I get that for teachers, especially when they're trying to work with students around their ability levels. But I just tell them like it's really important to see them all as individuals, even though they might all live in this project that's surrounding the school. And then siblings is something that you see more so in schools in underserved communities. Like there might be three multiple siblings, like in the school. Like there could be a head starter, a third grader, and a fifth grader, or they might
Hmm.
even all be back to back to back, like a year apart. Um, and so, granted, that gives teacher a notion about mom, about the number of kids that they've had back to back. But it's important, like, not to think all of those children are alike. Like, if the oldest sibling, like, maybe has caused some challenges, hopefully, we can get the resources that they need for that student to be successful, but don't automatically treat the other siblings as though they're the same challenge.
Hmm.
Um, and so oftentimes that takes work on the admin team to be willing to do some switch up with the teaching staff and like who's getting what student. Um,
Hmm.
and then having all teachers commit to doing the same sort of like familiar interviewing with their families. And then also being committed to having Meet the Teacher night that is at an effective time for that community, but maybe not necessarily an effective time for the end of your contract hours. So if you really want to connect with the families and you really want their support throughout the school year, because you're going to need it, Meet the Teacher at 3 o'clock might not work for this community. But you chose to come work, at this title school or if it's this marginalized school where like parents work till 6 o'clock. We
Hmm.
might have to have Meet the Teacher from like 6:30 to 9, like or something. If you really are genuine about wanting to make that connection.
Yep.
And oftentimes if we do these community polls and we have a community back to school event, um, you can start to get community supports, around the school. Like you can find out like who are the pillars of that community. Like, is it a potential like a gang leader? Is it a certain pastor? Is it a certain community center director? Like, who is it that these people in this community really look to for influence? And if you can get them on your side, as school teachers and admin, then you'll have a much more productive school year and flow of safety throughout your building if you can do that.
Hmm.
But to do that, we have to get out and, like I said, outside of those contract hours, begin to break down some of those walls of separation. And so it is a certain commitment that teachers and administrators take when they choose to go to schools in underserved communities because it's not going to be the same as someone across the track at a more affluent school where they walk into their class at 7 o'clock with their Starbucks coffee, and at 4:15 they're in their car like headed to the gym. Like it's not going to be like that.
I mean,
Go ahead.
everything that you're describing there is that I'm sitting there and it's like, so if you are the teacher or you're the one that's kind of starting out that relationship with the family and the student, and you see yourself as the informer versus the one being informed through the process, is that you've already started down that wrong track. Is that
Mhm.
it sounds no matter what job you're in, no matter what walk of life you're a part of at that point, the most important thing to do is to stop, listen, and be informed before decision making. And
Mhm.
decision making needs to be collaborative. But I do understand that teachers, they're stressed, they're overworked, they have at times way too many kids in their classroom. Their disposition and frustration, like you described, it's you're gonna see that in the body language. When somebody's fatigued and tired, it's going to be there, but it does sometimes lead to bad decision making. So, I mean, how do you improve that student teacher relationship when you have these risk of emotional behavioral disorders, which obviously are taking a toll on the teacher as well, just because they're trying to navigate 30, 35 kids at one time sometimes, and they just don't know how to be able to make it happen. And you can see that frustration boiling, and then they might choose an exclusionary practice. I want this child out of my class.
Yeah, yeah. So the first thing is like building that trust with the student, because any student who suffers with some sort of emotional or behavioral disturbance, um, trust and empathy is something that they look for. And so if that child doesn't trust you, it doesn't feel like you're genuine or you really care about them. Um, they will always do things to be in the offense of you. So, really working to build that trust through showing empathy toward that student and then also being consistent in your communication. So, that checking in, that making them feel emotionally safe is really important. So, that's where like check in, check out comes from in our research literature and why it's effective for students with emotional behavior disorders or whom are at risk because they do like that touch base. Um, Traditionally, check in, check out is done with like an administrator, an assistant principal, a behavior dean, someone other than the classroom teacher. But I'm really focused on keeping that teacher student relationship intact or repairing it. And so I like the teacher to be the implementer of this check in, check out. So just being consistent in that. Teachers being educated and using positive reinforcement, making sure they're setting clear expectations and not making assumptions that these students know how to behave or act in the ways that they are requesting. And then just creating a safe and supportive learning environment. And also remember that safe and supportive isn't always like 5 tables across the room with 5 seats at each table and butts in every seat for 50 minutes at a time. Like that's not always a safe and inclusive learning environment. Like it might look like, you have these groups of tables, but maybe they're all not in chairs. Maybe we have some flexible seating. Maybe you have some even standing up with a clipboard because they just work better if they can just wiggle and widget. Like being flexible and what that safe and inclusive environment looks like. And then the other thing that I like to mention in improving these relationships is beginning to implement some sort of social and emotional programs to help students develop this self-regulation and interpersonal skills. This is something, in the last 5 to 7 years that has been forced upon teachers in schools, even more so post COVID. But students are coming to school not really knowing how to communicate what they need. And this just isn't, indicative of minoritized students. This is all students, like not really being able to say, like, I'm upset because, or I feel angry or sad because, like, they just we're not going through those emotions and those things at home in the way in which we used to with our parents. And so some of that could be due to like we have a larger generation of even younger parents who aren't really in tune with their own emotions necessarily. And so since they're not in tune with their emotions, they're not helping their children be in tune. And so we need some sort of programming so that students can effectively communicate what they need instead of acting out or crying to gain our attention and our support. And if we're able to do that, then we can spend more time focused on the curricula and learning. And so to help teachers do this, some sort of amount of time per week needs to be set aside either through social emotional programming or some sort of enrichment time to work on those interpersonal skills.
I love that. And I couldn't agree more is that, I mean, when you're looking at those social emotional skills, is that they've deteriorated over time, is that the way kids communicate with each other has become very distant, very passive, and at times as it
Very,
can
very
be,
techy. Just
yeah, very techy. And you can get away with saying and responding in ways with tech that maybe you wouldn't want to be accountable for if you actually had to have those social relationships. But I mean, one of the things that You mentioned a lot of the things on the individual level. Um, my mind always goes to is that one person, whether it's a teacher or an administrator, can't be the one accountable for the entire system. They can help support the entire system, but the peers in this school and the fact that they can help each other to achieve these goals if you set up the right system, whether that's a positive behavior support system. um, I think that empowering the students to kind of understand and take the skills that are being taught and use them with
Mhm.
each other is how you create a new system of care.
Mhm.
What is the role of other students in this process? Because you've done a lot of work with positive behavior interventions. Is how do you encourage a culture of support that goes beyond just the student teacher relationship?
Um, so I'd say encourage these supports is we need to look at approaches that help our students develop a sense of belonging in our schools and specifically in our classroom neighborhoods or ecosystems, whatever the teacher chooses to call it. Um, and in doing this, it will improve their emotional regulation, which will also enhance their social skills. So, like, once they feel safe, then the student will feel comfortable, like beginning to talk, beginning to answer your questions, beginning to respond to prompts, beginning to go and initiate communication with like other people in the classroom, like making friends, building rapport, doing those things. The other thing that I think is really important is promoting equity in your classroom. So, to ensure that all students receive the support that they need, and also equity from the side that they feel protected in your space. So, within the space of equity, like it's not just Black students, white students, Asian students, not just race. It's also like type of family they come from. So if they come from a LGBTQIA family, if they come from a family where they have disability or siblings or parents or someone with a disability, in their household or in their immediate circle. Like if a comment is made or if a rumor is started or something, there should be some sort of backlash in your classroom that students can see you upholding where they feel protected and safe in your
Hmm.
space. Because that's where the feeling of exclusionary or not belonging or not being able to identify comes into play. And once a child feels that, it's really hard to repair it or to get it back because
Yep.
they're like, I'm not safe here. This is just like such and such. And so I like to encourage the use of diversity statements in the classroom. And a diversity statement that you can even come up with together, like, in this room, like all students are able to learn regardless of blah 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 blah, and have it be something that the students repeat daily right after you go through your five classroom expectations and you talk about examples of what these look like when we're doing it and then some non-examples. Then we go through our diversity statement and then talk through the class of, okay, so if we have friends that don't adhere to this guideline or this statement that we have in our room, what do we want that friend to have to do? So
Hmm.
besides something like an apology or writing a letter, like how will we hold the student accountable for engaging in this harmful act? Just
Absolutely.
so they can understand the severity of what they're doing at a young age.
Hmm.
Because oftentimes, kids will hear things and they think they're just repeating words because kids they don't really notice those things until we point them out. Like they
Yeah.
normally start noticing them like around age, 8 and 9. But before that, like we've got to point out like Timmy's different, or they don't see it. And
Hmm.
so I think in your diversity statement or somewhere in your rules and expectations, not allowing the outside to interfere in you all's bubble. So if the students weren't taught certain things about each other within your classroom bubble or your space, we refute it as like a lie,
Hmm.
like just to kind of keep some of the harmful things out
Yeah.
and keep the teacher from having to fight um, different little battles that could trigger different kids in different ways. So I think in doing that at the beginning and really explaining to your students, like, you have to protect the health of our class. And
Hmm.
so to protect the health of our class, we can't always say what they say on the bus about our friends. We can't come back and tell them it's going to hurt the health of our class because
Yep.
you might hurt their feelings and not know it. You might think you're helping, but you're not. So like we
Hmm.
have to protect our space by keeping those things out. And so that's just the beginning of teaching them to protect their like mental space, but
Oh,
without saying that term because they don't know what that means.
absolutely.
Um, yeah.
Well, I mean, the just even walking through that with you, it's the ability for somebody to eventually access the academic material starts with, can you create the correct social space for that to occur? And I mean, you had mentioned building rapport, you had mentioned equity and belonging, and then just even navigating these social situations is that this is for a lot of kids, school is, a majority of their day, their largest social group that they're having to navigate.
Hmm.
And it's a place to start harnessing some of those skills of, it's almost more important to be able to navigate social environments than it is to know a simple academic fact. If you can start those learning and the ability to be able to kind of engage others, you're going to be a lifelong learner,
Hmm.
because you're willing to do so. So I think that that emphasis that you just put on being able to create that social space, that
Hmm.
comfort, the value of others, understanding differences are important components of any sort of community in order for us to all grow. Is that it sounds like that's pivotal for any education
Hmm.
classroom. Now, we've heard so much today that I would imagine this could be like a 5 episode thing, and we still wouldn't tackle everything. But we're going to have a lot of educators, a lot of administrators, a lot of parents that are going to wonder, how can I gain some of these resources? I need to start educating myself and others around me on the value of implementing this within my school. What are some of the resources that you'd be recommending?
Yeah, so the first, of course, I want to recommend pbis.org, which is put on by the partners and directors of the National Center on PBIS, which is actually funded through the Department of Education. So they put out a lot of literature and guidelines, or I should say we, to help schools and districts assimilate themselves in school-wide PBIS, as far as tools, resources, how to get started, and also different information that you need to know as a parent if you are in a school or district that says this is a way that we're going about things and you want further understanding. Another one is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. So CASEL.org, CASEL.org. It can tell you some of the basic competencies of social emotional learning. So, looking at that self awareness, social awareness, responsible decision making. So, looking at those different components and how you can work with your child or your children on those strengths at home, and even how you can talk to your child's teacher about it should you need to. Another thing that I'd like to recommend is the book called The Brain by Zaretta Hammond. You can get that on um, Amazon. It's called Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. But this is a good resource, I think, for teachers or educators or parents who are kind of interested in some of the readings that educators might be participating in. But I think this is a very good sort of like book club reading for teachers to kind of get an understanding about why there are different ways that we need to teach and why these different approaches work in different ways for students from different backgrounds, especially for those of us who've kind of gotten like boxed in and comfortable. So I think that's a really good book. And also, in doing a lot of this work, like understanding our own implicit bias is really important. So, another book called White Supremacy and Me, I'd recommend reading that book. It's written by a white woman, so it doesn't come from a place of harm or a space where, white teachers or administrators may feel attacked. However, there might often be moments of conviction in reading that text, but I think sharing that text with your colleagues of color and having some guided discussions, which there are many now that you don't have to come up with it on your own, but there's many that you can just get off Google for free to have some guided discussion with your colleagues of color and with other colleagues, just to help make some of the connections and maybe break down some of the walls, not only that you've had with families or with students, but that you may have even had with some of your colleagues, because we do need the support of our um, collegial staff, so like other teachers in your grade level. You at all times we all say the wrong thing. So something could have come up that you've said about a student, and you really didn't know how to like backtrack and like clean it up, and vice versa. They could have done the same thing. So in working through this book together, you can kind of gain some of those shared experiences and maybe understand like where they were coming from when they made the off-color comment, or where you were coming from when maybe you were triggered by it. So doing some of those things so that we can repair and have really strong teacher and admin teams. So I think that's a good book for those teaming purposes. And then there's a few other podcasts that I'd say are helpful since you're listening to this one, which is also great. But The Educator's Blueprint is a really nice podcast that's done out of the Missouri PBS Center. So like shameless plug, but they have a lot of diverse practitioners, teachers, and faculty on there that you might find helpful if you're into listening to these sort of like back to school like podcasts. I liked that one before I was a guest on it, so I think that's a good go-to.
Yeah, there's so much valuable information out there. And like you said, it's just being able to have those discussions and being willing to be a learner through the process is probably the most important thing. And then utilizing these resources in a productive way to be able to shape how you're interacting with the community around you.
If I can just add one more thing as a parent, I think it's really important to remember that no one's going to advocate for your child in the way that you will advocate for your child. So you cannot hold the outcomes that you want for your child. You can't base it on teacher going to help you, principal's going to help you, counselor's going to help you, social worker. Don't do that. Don't even believe it. I'm not saying that the people in those positions aren't positive people and they don't really want to help your child, because they probably do, but no one wants your child to succeed more than you. So if anything ever doesn't make sense to you, like, you as a parent have the right to question it. And if you
Mhm.
question something and you don't get the response that you were hoping to get, or that you think makes sense, then you go up that chain of command and question again. And then hopefully my information will be shared through this podcast. So feel free to reach out to me or any other academic, especially in the realm of special education. I know they'd be more than willing to help or support you. We all do check our emails. Response times may be a little slow, but I'm sure they'll read it and respond to it. So just reach out if you need further help or resources, or you don't understand something. Don't allow someone to tell you, like, this is the end of the road or this is all we can do, because it's simply not true.
That's so appreciative of the fact that you're willing to give your time. And I appreciate the fact that you came on today to be able to share your time with us as well, because it is valuable that you've done so much of this work, and just being able to be out there and to be able to talk about it and start those conversations amongst other people. And now their interests start to be piqued. Hopefully we start to build this momentum of people that are now questioning some of the things that maybe they're seeing within their own school system. But thank you so much, Dr. Campbell, and hopefully we can get you back on the program some other time to be able to further go into some of these questions and issues.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.